is Congressman Jason. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Congressman Jason Crow from the 6th District of Colorado. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this really important discussion on the intersection of climate change and national security. As a co-chair of the Democratic House's National Security Task Force, I've been working with my other co-chairs and with other members of Congress to make sure that we are addressing boldly and aggressively the deep national crisis and national security challenge of climate change. We know that climate change is really the issue of our generation. It impacts every element of life, including national security. I come at this issue from a lot of different angles. I was a soldier myself that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm now a member of Congress that sits on the Armed Services Committee. But I also represent an Air Force base that is dealing with the very real issues of climate change and extreme weather as we look at what is national defense and what do our installations need in the decades to come to deal with this crisis. So, for me, looking at climate change, we know that it's changing fundamentally the face of the planet. We know with sea level rise, we're going to deal with more pandemics. We're going to deal with refugee displacements and instability throughout the world, more extreme weather, more difficult operating environments for our soldiers around the world. And we're already paying for this. Last year, the Department of Defense had to spend billions of extra dollars to help rebuild Air Force bases that had to deal with extreme weather. And as more and more of this happens, the costs of dealing with this for not only American taxpayers, but for people around the world are going to continue to increase. So this discussion is really meant to get a variety of perspectives on this issue and to get our arms around what we need to be doing going forward to address this issue. So I am very pleased to be joined by a number of my colleagues in the House, as well as an expert, Mr. John Conger. So we're going to begin today with my friend and colleague, Kathy Castor, Representative Castor from Florida, who is tasked with the very important responsibility in this Congress of chairing the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis that looked at comprehensively what are all the things that we need to do, from infrastructure to government policies to government spending to education to national security, and come up with 12 major pillars to address the climate crisis in a bold way. Representative Castor's committee just released those recommendations that cut across all of the committees of jurisdiction in the House of Representatives. And I'm really happy to have her join us today to touch on the work of that committee, what she learned, and what we need to be doing moving forward. Representative Castor, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Congressman Crow, and thank you for your service and dedication to our country. We're going to talk about climate change today, but I want to thank you and my Democratic colleagues, Congresswoman Escobar and the others who are on task for our National Defense Authorization bill that will be coming up here in the next week or two. I also represent an Air Force base, a very patriotic military community. MacDill Air Force Base is about a mile and a half down the road from my home where I am today. It's also the home of Central Command and Special Operations Command, and they are at the fore of the challenges we face in our national security. And I know a lot of folks often think of the challenges that war can bring, that what we have to be doing using our soft power as well. And they don't often think of climate impacts, but it is very important that we do so to protect our national security. Before we go to climate change, though, on behalf of all the military families I represent here in the Tampa Bay area, thank you for the 3% pay increase for our military families and all the other good work in the NDAA. Congressman Crow is correct. The House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis released a climate action plan at the end of June. It is a 500-plus page action plan for the Congress to tackle climate change. It cuts across all segments of society. And that means it cuts across all committee jurisdictions in the House of Representatives. I encourage you to go and examine our detailed report. You can get there through climatecrisis.house.gov or on Twitter @climatecrisis. If you don't want to work through all 500 plus pages, we have a good executive summary, and you can flip to the national security pieces there. You know, for a long time, the Department of Defense has been a leader in tackling climate change. They understand that the threats of a warming world present to our national security. That has not been as much the case under President Trump, who is not listening to scientists, doesn't listen to scientists and public health experts when it comes to COVID, and he's called climate change a hoax. So that's kind of put us back on our heels in preparing for the threats that climate change brings. So in our report, we make a number of recommendations to the Department of Defense that can be enacted in the Congress or by the Congress. First of all, the Department of Defense already has a climate change adaptation roadmap that it requires DoD to analyze climate impacts on our national security, on the missions of our armed forces, on global conflicts, and geopolitical instability. We recommend that we have to update and modernize that adaptation roadmap. We have to bolster the Interagency Climate Security Advisory Council, which was established under the fiscal year 20 NDAA to assess the global security implications of climate change. You have to bring the civilian population together with our defense experts to exchange important climate information. We want that group to actually go through scenario-based stress testing so that our armed services can cope with the disruptions that climate change will bring. We also, in addition to ensuring that our missions are cognizant of the challenges that the warming climate brings, our military installations also need to become more resilient to the climate impacts. So our report recommends that our installations domestically and internationally strengthen themselves through their energy supply, through their vehicles that they use, transitioning to clean electric vehicles, making sure that charging infrastructure is in place. They also need to be more resilient to sea level rise. I was able to visit the Hampton Roads area with Congresswoman Elaine Luria over the past year and talk with military leaders in her community to understand the challenges they face with sea level rise on the base. It certainly impacts all of our marine vessels, but even the most basic flooding issues to get in and out of the base are a concern. Overall, if you take a step back, what we need to do to combat and tackle the impacts of climate, we've got to transition to a 100% clean energy economy. Think of the foreign entanglements that will not be as complicated if we have a renewable, clean energy supply, and that if we can share that technology with nations across the globe and help our allies make that transition as well. Those are a few of the highlights, but I'll look forward to a few more questions and hearing from all of you as well.
Thank you, Representative Castor. Appreciate those introductory remarks and for your leadership putting together what is really an outstanding document of what needs to happen going forward across all of our committees. We appreciate it very much. Next, very proud to introduce not only a colleague, but a close friend of mine, Representative Rana Escobar, hailing from El Paso, Texas. Ms. Escobar has distinguished herself in this Congress as a fellow freshman, serving on the Judiciary Committee, but the Armed Services Committee as well, where we've had the opportunity to work together on climate issues, military resiliency, and also go on some congressional delegation travel where we've talked a lot with our allies, with our NATO allies and others. And I know we can both speak to the fact that at the top of many of our allies' mind is how are we going to work together to address the climate crisis and do it in a very productive way. So I will let Veronica speak to that, but thank you so much for joining us and for continuing to lead on these issues. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you so much, Representative Crow, and it's wonderful to see you. I'm so grateful to you for your leadership, for your friendship, for the vision that you have for a ready, modern military, and that we are responding to the big challenges that we're facing, and that we do it in a way that is respectful of our values and also respectful of our allies, as you mentioned. I want to also thank Chairwoman Castor for the incredible work that she did on the committee. You have provided, Kathy, you've provided us with an incredible roadmap, and the amount of work that went into the roadmap and the plan and the vision that you set out for tackling the climate crisis. I want you to know I am so grateful for it, and it will really help us try to catch up after so much wasted time. You know, Kathy mentioned Representative Castor mentioned just a couple minutes ago about the fact that we have a president, unfortunately, who has set us back. And as it is, we are unfortunately already very behind on trying to tackle what is a crisis unlike any crisis that we have ever faced, certainly in our generation. And I believe any kind of crisis that humankind has faced to date. And so how do we do it? Well, the roadmap that Representative Castor laid out is one of those ways, but we also have to look at where the big producers of greenhouse gases and greenhouse emissions are. And frankly, the military is one of those contributors. And so we are part of what's making things more challenging. Well, that presents an opportunity, though. And the opportunity is, how can the military, which has already in many ways led on this issue, how can it really push and lead even further, especially when we've lost so much ground over the last few years? That's why I am so proud to have worked on bicameral legislation, the DoD Climate Resiliency and Readiness Act, which requires the DoD to adapt its infrastructure and operations to address climate change and work toward true energy efficiency, something that we know doesn't just make us more ready, but as Representative Crow mentioned, we are already spending money on the consequences of not having addressed the climate crisis. And so it is far more efficient, effective. It's common sense that we should get on the preventative side, that we need to get on the front end. And so we need to use every avenue possible, and the NDAA is an important avenue toward addressing the climate crisis. I also led the Targeting Environmental and Climate Recklessness Act, or TERCA, a proposal to extend sanctions authority to environmental reckless endangerment. We have added some other really important pieces to the NDAA that help get us to where we need to go. But, you know, just as we are seeing with this global pandemic, where we have a global crisis sweeping the nation, where we need to be all working together because we're all in it together. We need to address the climate crisis with the same kind of urgency, the same kind of collaboration, but also that same kind of look inward about what each one of us can do to change things. There's no silver bullet. It's not going to happen overnight. And so we need to continue to look at every one of these avenues, take advantage of them, see them as opportunities so that we can continue to chip away at this existential crisis that our children will inherit, that our grandchildren will inherit, and that we have played a role in creating. So with that, Mr. Crow, I will yield back and thank you for this really important opportunity to talk about this urgent crisis.
Thank you, Representative Escobar. Appreciate your remarks and for joining us. Now, our next guest today, we would be really hard pressed to think of anyone or find anyone who knows more or has been working on this issue longer than Mr. John Conger, who for many years has been working at the intersection of national defense and climate change and climate security. He's held many roles, both in government and in the private sector. He was the principal undersecretary of defense dealing with this issue, dealt with installations and energy and military resiliency. And in his current role, he is leading as the director of Center for Climate and Security. So, Mr. Conger, thank you for joining us. Looking forward to your remarks. I'd also would be remiss not to mention the fact that you joined several of our roundtables last year. I convened the Sustainable Power Initiative in the House of Representatives, where we convened experts both in the private sector and government and in the foundation world and think tanks to start talking about what needs to happen in our military, what needs to continue to happen, because you and the military has been leading on this issue for a long time, but what needs to continue to happen to double down on this issue and really catalyze some of the existing efforts. So, John, look forward to your thoughts, and thanks for joining us today.
Congressman, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this forum. I really do appreciate it, and I'm always happy to talk about the national security implications of climate change. You know, climate change is reshaping the world, so it's not just a security issue, it's an economic issue, it's a health issue. And I think one of the things that the military has recognized for quite some time is that they give themselves a blind spot if they ignore this issue and they pretend it doesn't exist. And so they don't. They pay attention, and they have paid attention. I'm with the Center for Climate and Security, and so that center is focused on making sure that people are aware of the issues and what the implications are, and then advocating for commensurate actions to be able to address the security problems that are created by climate change. Let me just talk about a few of those risks, just to sort of set the stage here. And I think all three of you have mentioned several of them, so I apologize for repeating a little bit. First, there are installation impacts, there are infrastructure impacts, and at those installations, there are training and readiness impacts from extreme weather, from flooding, from drought, from wildfires, from permafrost thaw. All of these things affect infrastructure. All of these things affect how people train and operate on a base. Extreme examples, such as hurricanes hitting Tyndall Air Force Base or Camp Lejeune, or the huge floods that hit Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, can cost billions of dollars to recover from and to react to. And what we don't often talk about is the readiness impacts that those have. When you take a base offline, it has a significant military impact. A second sort of set of impacts are the new missions that the DoD has to think about. And the best example of this is the opening Arctic, where the Navy has a whole new ocean to patrol, and Russia and China are both looking to exert influence over this new operating area. We have to be prepared to operate there too. A third one is what we often call the threat multiplier impact. It's the fact that climate change around the world makes bad situations worse. When you have food insecurity and water scarcity, you have sea level rise and economic displacement and migration, that tends to lead to friction and can lead to conflict. And those are the kinds of conflicts that we have to react to. I think it was Secretary Mattis who said in congressional responses that climate change leads to the instability, is causing instability in areas of the world where we're operating today. Well, that's certainly true. So one of the things that I think is very important for everybody to recognize is that climate change, we talk about the change because there's already been change. This is a today problem. There are changes that we have already caused that are creating military consequences that we have to respond to, whether that's operating here in the United States or that's operating around the world. So we have to be thinking about all of these things. We laid out responses to a lot of these in a document we published called the Climate Security Plan for America that you can find on our website. But I really think that it's worth talking about some of the future problems that we're going to have as well. We did publish a study in February called a Security Threat Assessment of Global Climate Change. And we looked at what, without guessing when this is going to happen, what would be the security consequence of getting to a 2-degree a global warming world or a 4-degree global warming world. When you look at those, I think we can't predict what the future is going to be, but you see some trends. You see more instability around the world. You see fragile governments that can't handle the stresses that climate change imposes. Sort of governance breaks down. You have more ungoverned spaces, which causes other security problems for us. Then you have a larger amount of uninhabitable spaces. We already have uninhabitable spaces in the world: the Arctic, the Antarctic, the Sahara Desert. There's more, but now we're going to have new ones, and those new ones are going to be where people live today. And so those people who currently live in places that will soon be uninhabitable will have to move to other places where people currently live, and that causes friction, and that causes stress, and that causes the possibility of conflict. I think the last thing that I'd mention in this context is that we see friction between nation states over international resources, and that might be the Arctic dynamics that I was talking about earlier, where there's going to be new resources that are available and accessible, and you have superpowers or great powers coming in to try and exert influence over them. But you also have, say, in a world where water is increasingly scarce, people who share rivers are going to have tension. All of Pakistan's fresh water comes from India. That is a recipe for, or is certainly an ingredient for, potential conflict and or tension between two nuclear powers. And that's something to worry about as well. I think I'd close with this thought. Climate change, the intelligence community has been talking about climate change for years. Since the Bush administration, they've been talking about this and warning about this threat in the worldwide threat assessment documents that they put out each year. At the same time, they've been warning us about global pandemics and the possible economic and societal impacts those are going to have. They've been right on the pandemic. This year has borne them out that their warnings were prescient. I think we need to be paying attention to the warnings on climate change as well, the security implications and the broader implications that it's going to have. Thank you.
Those remarks and for framing the complexity of the issue and for your continued work on this. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention your former colleague, Sherry Goodman, who has also been doing incredible work in this area and study, but helping to move the ball down the field on this as quickly as possible as well. So thank you. So now we're going to do a couple of quick questions here. John, as you know, last year, one of my bills, the Military Installation, Resiliency, and Assuredness Act, we were able to get enacted in the National Defense Authorization Act. And what that bill does is require every major military installation to conduct an assessment, comprehensive assessment of the impacts of climate change and extreme weather and other things from a changing planet, and really get our arms around what needs to be done for adaptability and mitigation. In 2014, there was an initial roadmap for adaptability that the DoD moved forward on. There were some gaps in that roadmap that we've learned from, and we actually did it again just in the last couple of weeks, kind of resurfacing that roadmap along with my colleagues Jim Langevin and Don Bacon to again put that roadmap back into the NDAA and make it more effective. What gaps have you seen in our understanding of the impacts of climate change to our installations in particular, and what more needs to be done to conduct the assessment and have an effective roadmap?
So in order to answer that question, let me talk about what was great about the two projects that you just spoke to. First, your legislation was really important because all of the studies that had come to pass before then had been very broad. It had been like sort of let's look at everything all at once. But the problem is that every base has a different problem. It has a different mission, has a different geography, has different vulnerabilities and resiliencies. Some bases have their water plants on the base, some have it off the base. The dependencies are wide and varied. At Norfolk, there are flooding problems and there's going to be extreme heat problems in other parts of the country. So you have to really look base by base by base, because you're not going to be able to get it at one big, let's boil the ocean look. So planning might not be sexy, but it's where you get your insights for what actually has to be done to protect the base. The roadmap when we put the roadmap together in 2014, I think we were at the very beginning of understanding the implications of the issue and what it meant for DoD. So much has happened since then. So many impacts at individual bases and understanding what the threats are. And frankly, DoD's done a lot since then as well. In both administrations, in fairness, I think it's fair to say that in the current administration, Secretary Mattis allowed a lot of this stuff to continue to go on. They have directives and plans in place that they continue to follow, and so it's more like rather than saying they put their foot on the brake, they took it off the accelerator a little bit, and I think it needs to be put back on the accelerator. So what the new roadmap is going to be able to do is come up with a new to-do list. It is really to go out and look at all parts of the enterprise and say, here are the next steps that need to happen in order for us to continue to push the ball forward, rather than just sort of going on momentum.
Thank you, John. No, that's really important, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to figure out how we can improve on the work that's already been done and continue to learn from what we're doing. So we're running a little bit short on time. So what I'm going to do is, instead of going to Representative Castor and Representative Escobar to have them ask questions, what I might just do is go to closing remarks to starting with Representative Castor, to make sure we're staying on time here, because everyone has a lot of obligations, and I want to respect everyone's time. So Representative Castor, would love your closing thoughts on what more we can be doing, and really, building on your incredible work. What are the next steps here?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Crow and Mr. Conger and Congresswoman Escobar. I think you've highlighted some of the need for this work, the threats to our national security, the instability in the world, the need to become more resilient. You know what you're doing at the same time as you're protecting our national security, you're also saving taxpayers a lot of money in pushing the resiliency analysis up front for our military installations and force-wide. So that's going to be a tremendous benefit to our country. I also wanted to just share a conversation I had this morning. I was on a video conference with a number of members from the European Parliament, the folks who are the leaders in the environment and climate portfolios. And they expressed to me how hungry they are for America to return to its leadership role in the world when it comes to national security, our alliances, but also in tackling the climate crisis. They had numerous questions about whether our report had a chance to be enacted into law. They're very interested because they right now in the European Union and many other countries and alliances, they are focused on an economic recovery package that helps transition to clean energy and makes their countries more resilient. So that's one of that's going to stick with me, and really gives me it stiffens my spine a little bit to work as hard as I can, not just for my military families, for my community, for our great country, but we have a responsibility here in America, and it's a moral responsibility, a duty to our kids and future generations as well to tackle this and bring all of the expertise, scientific knowledge, know-how that we have here in the United States of America and help solve the climate crisis.
Thank you, Representative Castor. Appreciate that very much. Next, Representative Escobar, some closing thoughts on the path forward.
Thank you so much, Representative Crow and Representative Castor. Mr. Conger, thank you so much for all the information you've shared with us, for spending some of your time with us today to help us educate our constituents and the public about the role that those of us who are in the national security space, the role that we can play in addressing the climate crisis. I think I want to close just with an idea, and I think that all of the work that's led up to this moment has really brought us to a point where we have to begin allocating significant resources to addressing the problem. And my DoD resiliency bill would have provided, it's not law yet, but it would have provided a dedicated line item for DoD budgeting on all of these efforts. And I believe that having a single fund for energy resiliency and climate matters really could ensure that we move as quickly as possible and we advance our goals. I think we also, though, to Kathy's point, we have to share with the taxpayer what we're mitigating, the costs that we're mitigating, the investments that end up going to the consequences of the climate crisis. And I think at that point, every taxpayer across America would be all in once they see the cost benefit of resourcing, addressing this crisis, but not just the cost benefit, but also the returns on our investment. And so I thank all of you for the opportunity to work together on such a pressing issue. And Mr. Conger, I look forward to learning far more from you in the future.
Thank you, Representative Escobar. So I think that's our time for today. I want to thank again Kathy Castor from Florida, Rana Escobar from Texas, and John Conger from everywhere in my book. So everywhere I go, I see you. So you're a very busy man. But thank you for joining us. The takeaway from me is the threat is already here. We're not talking about a future issue. The costs are already here. We're already spending billions of dollars to deal with this. So either we're smart about it and we actually proactively get our arms around mitigation, we get our arms around resiliency, so we have to spend less and we save the taxpayers' money, we save on DoD budget, and we also, by the way, protect our troops by both reducing threats, but also enhancing their operations and ability to do the work that we ask them to do by understanding the various threats, both operationally and externally. So we know what we need to do, right? And thanks to the work of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, we have an incredible roadmap to take us forward. Now it's time to continue to do that work and to push forward boldly. So thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.